Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to a Foreigner album ranking. So the band itself formed back in 1976. They're the same age as me, which means they are nearly 50 years old at this point. During that time frame, they've released 9 studio albums. Wish it was more, but it is 9. Sold over 37 million copies in the US alone and over 80 million copies around the world. They're now due to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, take it for what it's worth at least. And they've got a new tie-in compilation album they're releasing called Turning Back the Time, featuring one new song that has original lead vocalist Lou Gramm on it. It's due out October 4th of 2024, and I thought it'd be a great time to take a look back at their catalog and rank the studio albums, all 9 of them, for Foreigner. So stick around for that. We're going to dive into it here in just a bit. But if you're new to my channel and haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also, leave a comment, hit like. All those things help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, if you turn on notifications, you'll never miss an episode and stay up to date on really cool videos just like this with a Foreigner album ranking. So as I said, 9 studio albums to go through. We're going to kick off at number 9, and that starts with Mr. Moonlight. This one here came out in Europe in 1994, the US 1995. It was their 8th studio album at the time, and a reunion album at that had the return of original lead vocalist Lou Gramm in the lineup. But it'd also be the last one to feature him, so kind of a bittersweet element to the album overall. Now, it had been 7 years since Lou Gramm had released an album with the band. Inside Information 1987 was the last one. In between, Lou Gramm went on to do solo stuff, and Foreigner continued on with Johnny Edwards as vocalist. But the band did reform, or reunite, I should say, in 1992 and released 3 new tracks as part of the Very Best and Beyond compilation. And those 3 songs, at least for me, I think hit the mark a lot more than this, or the songs on this album here. Opening track, Under the Gun, I think it was a really good song on here, but it sort of falls off after that. And then the song Big Dog, which is a track 5 on here, is a very jarring song for me. It's not very typical Foreigner style. It's nice, I guess, for them to be branching out a little bit, but it did break up the flow and the overall feel of this album. And so for me, at least, while still a very solid album, still sounds very good. You know, in my opinion, Foreigner doesn't make bad albums. There's just some that are, better than others. And this one here, not as good as some of their other albums, which is why it's coming in at number 9. Okay, moving on to number 8, Unusual Heat from 1991, their 7th studio album. This one here, first one to not feature Lou Gramm, and taking over on vocals was Johnny Edwards, the gentleman I mentioned a little bit earlier. Now, he comes from Montrose and King Cobra, so he had fronted Montrose for the Mean album in 87 and King Cobra 3 in 88. And then Mick Jones reached out to him, tapped him to take over for Lou Gramm. And personally, I think he did a really great job on this album here. So certainly no, fault of his own for this album not being bigger than it was. But it was the band's first album in 4 years, having had a new vocalist. It was the first album of the 90s. And so needless to say, I think that's part of the reason the album itself didn't fare as well as other albums. But the album itself, I really appreciated its more rock approach to things. It did definitely fit the moment, the style, and the era that was going on at that time. And Johnny Edwards as a whole, I think, fit perfectly vocal style wise. He wasn't that different from Lou Gramm, but he definitely had his own style and flair with songs like Only Heaven Knows, Low Down and Dirty, and I'll Fight for You. I just don't really get why this album wasn't any bit bigger, except that probably had a lot to do with the fact of the time, the era, and it just really wasn't the right time for Foreigner to be releasing a new album. Okay, so we're going to move on to number 7 here. Can't Slow Down from 2009, their 9th studio album, currently their latest and unfortunately probably their final studio album, which is one of the reasons I'm choosing to go ahead and do my album ranking here, as I'm not expecting the band to be dropping any new album anytime soon. And it's really unfortunate that in the last 15 years, we only got this album here as the lineup for this really good. It's a very strong album. This one here, though, Mick Jones introduces an entirely new lineup for the band itself. He is the only original member left at this point, but new vocalist Kelly Hansen, who comes in here, I think does a killer job. He's got a lot of power and inspiration throughout the songs themselves. And in this one here, I think it's a step above Unusual Heat from 91 and Mr. Moonlight of 94, which we've already talked about. The sound of this album here had them returning more to that classic vibe, at least in my opinion. Each song on here was written as though it was like a one-off song, meaning the kind of songs that bands will often write or put together for compilations where they've only got to do one new song or two or three like they did for Very Best and Beyond. And that's one of the reasons oftentimes those songs are so good and can stand up. They're not trying to write an entire album. But this album here, I felt like all of the songs were written that well on it. So it's a very strong, powerful album, very high quality all the way throughout. And the first 5 songs on here are simply amazing. You got Can't Slow Down. This one here, typical rocker on here. In Pieces, very catchy song. Both of those appearing on that brand new compilations that is coming out on October 4th. So you'll see exactly why those are included on there when you hear them paired next to their more classic material. Third song on this album, When It Comes to Love, has a very classic feel to it with the keyboard sound on it. Living in a Dream is another one that is a rocker, but it's very powerful, big feeling when the chorus rolls around on it. And I Can't Give Up, which is another amazing ballad. There was probably more ballads on this than rockers. Maybe one reason that it doesn't stand up higher than it could in their overall catalog. But I think the album is really great and holds up against that 80s classic stuff on here. And certainly had it been released in the 80s, I think the album itself would have done very, very well for the band. Coming in at number 6, Agent Provocateur from 1984, 5th studio album and follow-up to their big album number 4, right? Anything coming out after that album was going to do really well for the band, so it's really no surprise that this one was also very successful for them. And while it's a great album, and I do like the album, for me at least the production is where it falls a little flat. It's a little thin at different times, a little bit too much of that 80s sound for me. And I know that's a little shocking for some of you guys that know me from my channel, because I generally like albums with that 80s production level on it. I just don't think that it came across very well on this album here. It could have been much bigger and more full. And as I said, I think it comes across a little thin. The thing is, still has one of my all-time favorite songs from the band on this album. And no, it's not I Want to Know What Love Is. Great song, just that one in particular for me at least is way too overplayed. I've probably had enough of that song, but the song that really stands out for me is That Was Yesterday. It's both subtle and powerful at the same time. It's one of the songs on here for me at least that makes this album a really solid effort. But again, it's the production that brings it down in here. And so I think this album would really benefit if they would do a remix on it. They have done remixes of a selection of songs for greatest hits, which actually appeared as part of a bonus disc on this. So they're no stranger to doing the remix treatment. I would love to see it happen on this album here. Other songs on here, really, really good songs like Growing Up the Hard Way. And I think that that one in and of itself would really benefit. We'd hear the extra power and everything. It would hit harder like earlier material. And it might make this album stand up a lot greater than it already does. That's at least my opinion on it. But certainly this album, great album, no lack of quality material here, which is why it is coming in at number 6. All right, coming in at number 5, Inside Information from 1987. Last studio album to feature Lou Gramm on it before he returned in 1992, and then ultimately for Mr. Moonlight in 1994. Now, this one here, 3 years after Agent Provocateur, and probably had a big reason why as to it having the different production level that it did, but regardless, it fixes all of those issues that I didn't like, that thin sound on Agent Provocateur. This one here, it restores that big, powerful sound that I like from Foreigner on it. And so in my opinion, this one here returns them in a big way. Sounds more like their first four albums, at least a lot closer to that classic element, and some killer songs on this one, like Heart Turns to Stone, Can't Wait, Say You Will, which is another one of my favorite songs on here, all really helping to elevate the overall feel of this album. And now it's got one of their big ballads on it as well, I Don't Want to Live Without You. And that one is much more close to typical Foreigner fare than, say, I Want to Know What Love Is, albeit that one was their big hit. Either way, I tend to like this album more for a number of reasons, whether it be the songs, be the production. All in all, that's why this one here is elevated to the 5th position. Okay, coming in at number 4, Head Games from 1979, third studio album and first to feature new bassist Rick Wills, coming in from Small Faces. He played on the debut David Gilmour solo album. He also would go on to play with Bad Company. That was actually the first place that I knew him from before getting into Foreigner and really understanding who everybody was. But Rick Wills replaces original bassist Ed Gagliari. And this would also be the last album to feature 2 other members, Ian MacDonald and Alan Greenwood, on here. And this is where the last album would be that, before Mick Jones really kind of took over on things here. But also be the last time that he would sing lead on a song on a Foreigner album. And this album here, it's the modern day. So I guess when you have Lou Gramm, such a powerhouse vocalist, why would anyone else sing? But I did like that they used to be a 2-vocalist band, at least up until this point here. A lot of hit songs on this one. Dirty White Boy, Head Games, Rev on the Red Line, all great stuff, making for a very strong album. The thing though, it doesn't quite flow as well as some of their other ones. That at least is why this is coming in at number 4. And we go on to number 3 here. Foreigner, self-titled release, 1977 debut studio album. This one here is about as classic of a sounding album as you can get for the debut. Just as good as any of their first 4 albums, in my opinion, but each one being kind of bigger than the next. For various reasons, one or the other. But this one here, I think, is set apart from those albums in terms of the keyboards that are on here. And we have 3 different guys playing the keyboards. So whether it's Mick Jones, Ian MacDonald, or Al Greenwood on here, all very striking performances from them, all doing slightly different things, but also really setting the album itself and the sound of Foreigner apart from their peers at the time. And it's one of the things that I think makes this album stand out so many years later. At this point, 47 years later on, this album still has a really interesting sound to it, making it be one of the big albums out of the 70s. And then 3 really well-known songs off of here and standout tracks like Feels Like the First Time, Cold as Ice, and Long, Long Way From Home. I love the sax sound on Long, Long Way From Home, all making this one here the reason why at least it is coming in at number 3. But it's just a powerful, killer album from start to finish. Okay, coming in at number 2, Double Vision from 1978, second studio album. It's not often that a second album can outdo a debut album, but in this particular case, I think it happened. This one here features 2 of the band's biggest songs, signature songs, really, Hot Blooded and Double Vision on it. The rest of the album just as good, but with those 2 songs on it, it's no wonder that the album did as well as it did. But it's a really strong album throughout. The thing is, it retains those striking keyboard sounds that I liked off of the debut, so that's continued on here. Then you get some other killer songs throughout this thing like Blue Morning, Blue Day, Lonely Children, which I think is a really standout, cool, deep cut on here. Spellbinder, awesome song. The album as a whole, it just simply rises above the others, and I think that has to do with the variety of material on this album. The band was still kind of finding out who it was, I think, and so that ends up making for a much more interesting fare throughout the album. And of course, this is when Foreigner was still a band, not solely run by Mick Jones. And so you had a lot of variety and interest throughout coming from those different band members, going everything from Beatlesque moments all the way up to the hard rocker songs that we know and love from Foreigner on here, but all major reasons as to why this one comes in at number 2. Okay, and the number 1 album, I don't think you were probably very surprised by this, but 4 from 1981, their 4th studio album, arguably their biggest album and or most famous albums, probably the reason I got the shirt at least. But it's also the one where the band really shifted away from being a true band effort into being led by Mick Jones and Lou Gramm. That doesn't mean that it's a bad thing though. This album in particular, everything tightened up, became much more focused on this one here. It's a powerhouse of an album right from the get-go with Nightlife, followed up by the all-time classic Jukebox Hero, which is probably the first song I ever heard or at least knew that was a Foreigner song. Followed up by The Killer, Break It Up, and then the heartfelt ballad on here, Waiting for a Girl Like You, which is probably my favorite of all their ballads on it, even those other ones that I was talking about before. I love the driving rocker Luann. And then you get the classic Urgent, and it just doesn't let up from there. So many great songs on this album here, high energy all the way throughout, killer songwriting. The band is really firing on all 6 cylinders here, just a true classic album that captures a moment in time. And this one here being the first album that I bought, and no, it wasn't on CD. I actually bought this on LP in the very early 90s for $1 or maybe even less than that, I think, at my local record store. But definitely holding some nostalgia there, and certainly probably why, at least for me, it's coming in at number 1. All right, and so there you go. That is my Foreigner album ranking of all 9 studio albums. I'm sure you've got your favorites, and maybe it's slightly different order, than what I've got here. So let me know which is your number 1 album or which is you think might be their most overlooked album, and we'll go from there. All right, everyone, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.